One of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions is transport. Many of us travel to school or for work, to visit friends or family, for leisure and shopping or for holidays. And not only do we travel around, but we have goods and materials and services, Amazon delivering to our door. But my question is, what's the greenest way to travel? I went out, I did my research, did some maths, made some graphs, my happy place. And in this episode, I'm going to share my findings with you. And while most of it is actually still pretty obvious, some of the results are actually quite surprising. Welcome to Science with Steph, the show where I think way too much about the world around us and then share the best bits with you guys. This week I have been travelling a lot, so I've spent that time looking up the carbon footprint of various forms of transport, like the nerd that I am. So let's start with the one form of transport that we're told is the worst for the environment, where they keep cheating on tests to make them sound more environmentally friendly, where we're told to stop using them. Cars. No, not that cars. These cars. Modern cars have been getting more and more efficient, meaning you get higher mileage for the gas that you use and emitting less carbon per mile. Smaller cars tend to be more economic, and while diesel cars get better mileage than petrol, the diesel itself is actually more carbon intense, and so it kind of balances out. So I've worked out the range from highest to lowest of the potential carbon emissions per mile per car. The sources I used were from a study done by Exeter University, and I've done a whole worksheet with all my sources posted in the description box below. So here's what I found. A small petrol car with a decent mileage of around 40 miles per gallon will emit 280 grams of carbon per mile. Then cars that are bigger, less efficient or dieselier will emit up to nearly 500 grams of carbon per mile. So that's our starting point. So is there any way to improve this metric? Well, a good way to think about carbon emissions is not just the carbon per mile, but actually the carbon per person per mile. Carpooling is a great way to reduce your carbon footprint. And actually a car with 4 people in it produces nearly 4 times less carbon than a car with just 1 person in it. And I say nearly because presumably the car would run less efficiently when it has that much more weight in it. So what about electric cars? Well, the fuel for electric cars comes from the grid. So that depends on how the electricity is made. If you'd like to know how we make electricity, I already made a video on it, and you can watch that after this by clicking the card just there. So if we take the UK as an example, the carbon intensity of electricity generation has nearly halved since 1990. Which is pretty good. And it's currently around 160 grams per kilowatt hour generated. Don't worry about kilowatt hours, it's just what people that work in energy use to describe energy. It's like calories or joules, it's just a way of describing energy. So this gives plug-in electric vehicles an equivalent carbon emissions of just 23 grams of carbon per mile, and less per person per mile if you're driving more than 1 person. It does depend on the grid though. For comparison, if you generated all that electricity from just coal, you would have an equivalent carbon emission of 151 grams of carbon per mile. This is surprisingly still less than a very efficient car, but that's because big centralized coal power stations are much more efficient than small motors in cars. But big caveat warning right now, this study doesn't take into account the whole life cycle of an electric car, so that's including the cost of the materials and the batteries, which are quite carbon intensive. When you take all of that into account, it's actually not very environmentally friendly to chuck away a brand new petrol car to replace it with a new electric vehicle. Run your car as far as it will go, and then when you need to buy a new car, that's when you should consider buying an electric vehicle. It all gets awfully complicated, but that's my advice. Right, so we've seen that petrol cars are no good for the environment, and I can't afford an electric car. What about public transport? So trains are actually quite difficult to work out. On the one hand, you do have super duper highly efficient electric trains out there. But if you live in a country with a terrible service like ScotFail, then you'll end up on old rickety diesel trains that don't feel very good for the environment at all. A diesel freight train that hardly ever stops does pretty well at 30 grams of carbon per mile. And at the other end of the scale, a not very efficient, rickety old passenger train that's stopping and starting all the time does a whopping 200 grams of carbon per person per mile. Although I wouldn't take this and say, oh well then if it's not green to get public transport I won't bother. Busy services are healthy services, and putting that money into public transport means that the infrastructure will improve, electrification will happen, and that everything will get more efficient and greener as you go along. In fact, a highly efficient, electrified public transport system can be the most efficient way to get lots of people from point A to point B. I would absolutely highly encourage everyone to take public transport when and where they can. Right, so we're good at moving around on the ground. What if I want to travel further? What if I need to fly somewhere? Planes have some of the most advanced engines on our planet. And that's because it's so freaking difficult to get a whole bunch of stuff in the air. Because of this, once planes are at cruising altitudes, they're actually surprisingly efficient. The issue is getting up there and then getting back down again. So short haul flights that are just flying up and coming back down again have an insane carbon footprint of 610 grams of carbon per mile per person. And then see those tiny planes that you get to your connecting flight that have like 10 people on them. They are the worst offenders. Mile for mile, long-haul flights actually sit lower on the carbon emission scale than trains. Though just remember that the total carbon emitted is massive because you're flying thousands of kilometers rather than hundreds. So at the moment, there really is no low carbon way to travel a long distance quickly. We have witnessed the first ever solar plane to make a trans-Pacific flight. So I bet we'll see passenger versions in maybe the next 10 years or so. But until then, try to just avoid flying where you can, and definitely try to replace shorter flights. The data so far paints us a picture that we already kind of know. Cars and planes aren't great. You want a car share where you can, or replace with public transport. But what else could you replace your journeys with? Well, if it's short enough, you could replace it with walking, right? That's zero emissions. Well, not exactly. When we walk rather than drive, we are burning fuel, and that fuel is our food. Calorie consumption is extremely diverse, and it depends on your height, your weight, your fitness, all these things. But we tend to burn about 85 calories per mile, though quite a lot of that is just the usual calories that you'd be burning up anyway by, breathing and thinking and surviving. So the additional calorie content of actually just moving from A to B is actually about 60 calories. So what's the carbon footprint of our food? Well, in a previous video, I worked out that diets that are high in meat content actually have a really high carbon intensity, and being vegetarian about halves that. If you want to watch that, you can click the card. So our carbon footprint of walking a mile is not nothing. It's actually between about 100 and 200 grams of carbon per mile, depending on where your food comes from. Right, what? Okay, so even walking is bad for the environment? What am I supposed to do? Just lock myself in the house and not exist? Okay, cynical Steph, rein it in, otherwise you'll go down that rabbit hole of despair, and no one wants that. Remember, I'm not including all the other added benefits of walking, like reducing pollution in our cities, it being so good for your mental and physical health, and it just being a great way to see places. Want to know my favourite way of travelling? Cycling! Mile for mile, a bicycle and our bodies are the most efficient machines that we've ever made. Again, in this case, our fuel is our food. Cycling takes just 25 calories per mile. And again, depending on your diet, this results in a carbon footprint of about 45 to 90 grams per mile. Not bad. So here is the total graph. If you like it, I will share a Google document of this picture in the information below. All my sources are also listed in an Excel sheet if you want to verify them, and feel free to share this information with anyone that has any doubts. Okay, so what are my conclusions from my little study? Well, transport isn't as clear-cut as some people make it out to be. Carpooling, for example, is actually one of the greenest ways to travel around, as per person, it only has a carbon footprint of about 70 grams per person per mile, which is actually less than 4 meat eaters cycling the same distance. Public transport, while not always technically being the greenest way to travel, has the potential to be extremely green and relies on electrification of the system. Flying is bad, okay? Especially short flights. And walking and cycling isn't actually emission-free. It depends on your fuel. It still pretty much is the greenest way of getting about though, and the healthiest. So my question for you is, what way do you travel the most? And what way are you going to try to travel in the future to reduce your carbon emissions? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Science with Steph. If you did, please like it and share it. It massively helps out my channel. I try to bring out new videos every Friday. So if you want to be notified of when I upload, be sure to hit subscribe and don't forget to hit that notification bell. In the meantime, you can watch my last video by clicking here, or if you want to watch the episode that the YouTube algorithm thinks you'll enjoy best, you can click here. Alright, thanks, until next time, bye! Don't all look sexy.